With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. This is going to be fun. We're going to dig into a little bit of government bureaucracy and regulation. Yay, everybody loves to do this. I don't know if two wrongs make a right, but we're going to hope two Andys make great content. Our friend Andy Jung, Young Voices contributor. He has a doctorate of law. He studies this stuff. How are you, sir? Good morning. Thank you for spending some time with us.
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with some nomenclature here because, you know, once again, we have a term that gets thrown around, FTC, one of those, the famous three-letter agencies, Federal Trade Commission. Let's just start with the basic nomenclature here. What is it and where did it come from? Because it's kind of a unique agency because it's an independent agency, but it's got overlap with DOJ. It really is kind of an outlier in the federal government, isn't it?
Yes. So the FTC stands for Federal Trade Commission. It's an independent government agency, as you mentioned. It was created by Congress in 1914, and Congress gave it a few very specific responsibilities. More or less, the FTC oversees unfair methods of competition. It also polices unfair and deceptive acts or practices. And third, it polices anti-competitive deals, so it blocks mergers that will hurt consumers.
Now, we hear the term anti-competitive and antitrust. These get thrown around. You know, it's almost like HIPAA or something on Twitter. It gets used for absolutely everything, but these have actually really, really specific legal meanings. So before we delve into all that, just real quick, the corruption statutes that this was built off of, antitrust, what are we actually talking about with those terminologies?
So in terms of the FTC, it really focuses on harm to consumers. So when I talk about anti-competitive deals and anti-competitive conduct, I'm talking about conduct by corporations and firms that then goes and harms consumers. And that harm usually takes the form of increased prices. So a merger that would then raise prices on consumers would be anti-competitive.
Talking to Andy Jung from Young Voices. So one thing about this, when we were digging into it and doing a little prep work for this, is this agency actually has really widespread and quite powerful surveillance and investigative and oversight power. But a lot of that power it really hasn't historically used a lot of. And that kind of brings us up to the modern times of, you were writing a National Review about it, where some of our Congress folks and senators have noticed that they have all this kind of power and they kind of want to start focusing it in other areas than its traditional oversight, don't they?
They do. And I think we're talking specifically about the new prohibition that Congress is trying to enact on self-preferencing. Is that correct?
That is. Go ahead and explain that explain it to me like I'm five. The audience already knows all this stuff, I'm sure, but just walk me through it real nice and slow to make sure I've got it right.
Sure. So Congress has introduced a new bill. It's called the American Innovation and Choice Online Act. The main crux of that bill is to make it illegal for large technology companies to do what's called self-preferencing. Self-preferencing is when a large technology company favors its own product or services. So for example, if you do a Google search for a restaurant, Google places its Google Maps results at the very top of that search. That would be an example of self-preferencing. Another example is Amazon web searches. If you search for a product on Amazon, sometimes Amazon places its Amazon basic item that it manufactures there at the top of the search. That would also fall under the definition of self-preferencing.
Right. And that's online, of course. That principle at, like, for example, a grocery store would be what gets put on the front of the shelf, what gets put on an end cap, that sort of thing. It's kind of the same concept, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, we're all pretty familiar with this. I think we usually refer to it as generic products. Walmart has generic products. CVS has generic products. But once you put it onto the internet, Congress calls it self-preferencing.
And of course, the road that leads down to, and you know, the word trade commission's in the title of this organization. So let's just back up and cover that real quick. If you're going to get into almost a price control situation really, really quickly, because the whole idea of the generics is it's supposed to be a little bit cheaper. If you start picking and choosing things like that, now you're messing around with the market level pricing of it.
Correct. If you make it harder for these firms to make generic products which that they can then offer at lower prices, or you make it harder for them to promote these cheap products, they'll stop building them and consumers will lose access to these cheaper options.
Now, this is where your piece in National Review, when you went to write about this, the history of this organization, the Federal Trade Commission, how do we get to where they want to start picking and choosing what's on a shelf or what Amazon or Facebook or whoever puts on the front of their web pages? How does that tie into antitrust, which was kind of the core principle, and anti-competition, that was the core principle of this agency? That seems like a big gap that got filled. I'm assuming that didn't happen overnight. There was some mission creep in there somewhere.
Yeah, there has arguably been some mission creep in one specific regard that's caught my attention. And that's that the traditional unfair methods of competition and anti-competitive conduct, in those cases, the FTC was focused on protecting consumers, like I mentioned, making sure that prices don't go up. But in this case, in the case of self-preferencing, as we mentioned, self-preferencing conduct actually often creates lower prices for consumers. So in this case, with this bill, Congress is asking the FTC to shift its attention away from protecting consumers and keeping prices low to instead protect other competitors that are trying to compete on these platforms like Amazon and Google. And the Congress is now asking the FTC to protect those smaller competitors from this self-preferencing conduct, which is taking the FTC's eye off of the ball in terms of using its resources to protect consumers.
Yeah, talking to Andy Jung from Young Voices, it's important to note why you say taking their eye off the ball, because there's been some questionable stuff with this organization as far as their resources, as far as what they're able to do and not do. You detailed pretty extensively over recent history here, because you have congressional oversight, so these people have to testify publicly. By their own admission, they're having trouble just maintaining their core mission right now, aren't they?
They certainly are. And again, like you said, these are all quotes coming from the agency itself. So on August 3rd, last summer, the agency cited a tidal wave of merger filings that is straining the agency's capacity. The agency has also gone through some losses of staff, including its chief economist recently, and some members of the agency that are involved with some of the litigation that the agency is doing. The agency also has several rulemakings open to pass regulations in different parts of the economy. So the FTC certainly has its hands full without even having to deal with self-preferencing on the internet.
Why is it the overturn? Is it just the drain in federal employees we've been seeing everywhere? Is it a labor shortage? What's the problem with the FTC specifically? We understand we all knock the bureaucracy of government, and we, rightly so. But there's got to be some specific thing about this particular agency. Why are they having trouble with this? Why are they short staffed? Is there one or two things that's actually causing this beyond just normal machinations of bureaucracy?
Yeah, it's common enough to see staff turnover when there's a change in administration, like there was from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. But in this case, we're seeing much higher turnover than you would usually see in that case. And that probably has to do with the new, fairly extreme direction that the FTC has gone in the last 8 months. The FTC has said that it wants to set out to change the way that it regulates mergers and oversees the US economy, and has indirectly criticized senior staff on the FTC for being passive in the past, where now the agency wants to be active. So I think there is some discontentment among the staff, and some senior staff feel they've been criticized, and that's leading to turnover.
Now, to my unlearned ear, when I start hearing about a government agency that we've already established has pretty extraordinary investigatory and regulatory powers, they even have surveillance powers over a lot of companies. They have overlap with the DOJ on a lot of things. When I start hearing terms like aggressive, this doesn't sound like a regulatory agency that's looking to call balls and strikes and referee the economy as kind of a neutral party. This seems like they're looking to be the protagonist and to drive things the way they see that they want to go, or more specifically, the administration that they answer to.
Yes, from both the leadership in the FTC and from the Biden administration, both have signaled that they want to go after large technology companies. They've identified them as an enemy. And in that way, they're no longer calling balls and strikes. They're no longer neutral observers. They've picked the companies they want to go after, and they're picking the kinds of harm that they think these companies are causing in the economy, such as self-preferencing. As I mentioned, it's a pretty novel theory of harm as far as antitrust goes. So yeah, they are trying to push enforcement in the direction that they think it needs to go.
Is this the perfect storm of when you have an administration in the Biden administration, not picking on them, that's just who's in the chair at the moment. When you have the Biden administration saying that we're going to go after these tech companies, and then you have an agency that's saying, well, we're under resourced, this turns into the perfect storm of, oh, well, we can do this stuff and we can start getting those resources that we wanted because now we have a new mission statement and now we're the shiny new toy for funding and all those sort of things. We just kind of got to be adults and say, this is kind of how government works sometimes, isn't it?
Agreed. And I agree that there's no reason to beat up on the Biden administration. The prior Trump administration maybe even started this criticism of the technology companies. So it does go across both administrations. And I agree that we are heading towards a situation where Congress can tell the FTC, we want you to accomplish X, Y, and Z goals. Oh, you don't have the resources to accomplish your responsibilities. Well, we can give you the resources you need. Just be sure that you follow our roadmap for what we want you to regulate. And that's getting away from the independent agency model that the FTC is supposed to follow.
Yeah, we're talking to Andy Jung, sorry. I'm an Andrew. I keep saying Andrew. Andy Jung, Young Voices contributor, knows this stuff backwards and forwards. We're going to continue with him right after the break. We're going to get back into the American Innovation and Choice Online Act. We're also going to talk about how these agencies actually work a little bit, from the hearings to the regulatory practices. More with Andy Jung right after this on Heard Tell. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Thanks for staying with us. We got Andy Jung, Young Voices contributor, talking a little bit about tech regulation and the FTC. That's the Federal Trade Commission, for those of you playing along at home. Let's talk some bare bones here real quick. The only time folks really see the workings of these agencies are congressional hearings. This is something you cover a lot. You live tweet them, which is fun sometimes. Normally, we see the hearings that turn into clown shows because those are the nomination hearings, hot button issues. But you cover these hearings that are a little bit more mundane, but that's really the only time the public gets to see kind of the inner workings of these organizations like the FTC, isn't it?
It is. In certain ways, the FTC is public in some regards in that, like I mentioned, it's currently running some rulemaking and some rulemaking sessions to create regulations. And in doing that, the FTC asked for public comment. So in a sense, that's a very transparent, open process. But on the other end, we don't necessarily get to see which comments the FTC responds to and takes seriously and what actually goes into the final regulations that come out. So you're correct that these hearings where the FTC testifies in front of Congress or where the agency ask the technology companies to submit information to them are the only real indications we have of their agenda and what their attitudes are towards these companies.
Yeah, talking to Andy Jung, he's the legal fellow at Tech Freedom. Another along those lines, we talk about Congress and oversight, and we already talked about it a little bit with the FTC, but I think it bears mentioning that they have overlap with DOJ. They're semi-independent, but they're not under like the Department of the Treasury or DOJ specifically. So when they come up to Congress, it's really them and then the administration. There's not the layers that some of these other organizations have when they come up to Congress to testify. And that changes how they get oversight, doesn't it?
It does. The FTC has a certain amount of coordination that I can do with the administration. We've already seen it with Biden's executive order directing the FTC to focus on certain matters. And in that sense, the agency is getting directions directly from the executive branch, and Congress has a little bit less control and oversight.
Now, you are a legal fellow, so put your legal hat on for a second. Anytime we have a government agency, I don't know if expanding is the right word, but for lack of a better word, expanding their reach and their focus and looking to kind of do a new thing. At some point, some of this stuff, especially bumping up against major corporations that have deep pockets, that have, armies of attorneys and lawyers and lobbyists, some of this at some point is going to wind up in court, and there's going to be legal pushback on some of this somewhere, isn't there?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. If there's not much oversight currently of the FTC from Congress, we might expect to see some pushback down the line from the courts and from the judicial branch. And the American Innovation and Choice Online Act empowers the FTC to bring these self-preferencing cases to federal court. That's where they will end up eventually. And it's definitely possible that in these federal courts, the judicial branch could turn around and look at what the FTC is currently trying to accomplish and compare that to the FTC's intended mission and say, there's been some mission creep here and it'll cut the agency back to size. That's a possibility.
See, we talk about, those of us like me that just sit and commentate and observe on stuff and throw gas on the internet all day long. We talk about, legislating from the bench and judicial activism and those things, and those can be bad in most cases. But in a case like this, it's almost become by design because there's a gap there. So when you have an organization like the FTC that has kind of an ambiguous oversight process, it's almost inevitable, isn't it, that this is going to wind up in court, and the courts are going to, especially federal courts, they're going to end up putting the guardrails on what they can and can't do. And that's not always best for the agency itself, and that's not always best for the consumers and the people of the country, is it?
No, it's interesting the way it might play out, and it depends how you look at it. Some might call the ultimate situation of courts reigning in the FTC judicial oversight, or the courts legislating from the bench. But from a different perspective, you could call it federalism, and you could look at it as the courts keeping the executive branch and the legislative branch in their respective departments and keeping the powers separate to a certain extent. And in that case, it could be good for consumers, but ultimately it's kind of unclear the way it's going to play out.
Staying along that line of thought for just a second, though, is there some gap here where the legislative branch should be involved? We know they're putting this act in, but the act is basically, hey, the government agency needs to go do all this on their own. Is this one of those things where the legislative branch is maybe they're writing a bill to get something done, but they're also passing the buck on how it's going to get done? That's not particularly healthy either, is it?
No, I'd absolutely agree. I think Congress should approach this in two ways. Either Congress should let the FTC focus on its more salient responsibilities, like I mentioned, which is protecting consumers, and sort of let the self-preferencing continue to be studied and don't pass any laws on that quite yet. Or second, Congress should commit to regulating self-preferencing and give the agency more resources so that it can actually study self-preferencing, learn the ways that it harms consumers, and tailor the way the agency enforces the bill to protecting consumers and taking care of any harms that result from self-preferencing. At the moment, the Congress saying to the agency, you don't have the resources to police this, but police it anyways.
Which sounds horrible. And then when you think about the fact that there's a lot of government power that can be brought to bear behind that threat, that sounds even more horrible to me. I don't know what the good answer is. You had a couple conclusions in your piece when you wrote about it in National Review. What's some of the answers here, both to the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, but also structurally what it says about the FTC, some FTC, I should say, some of the things we should be working towards to maybe fix some of these issues?
I think the FTC should study self-preferencing much more carefully, identify some very specific harms that result from self-preferencing that are backed up by data and economics, and then create some very tailored regulations that prevent those specific forms of self-preferencing that result in harm to consumers. If we're just going to, I don't think the current path that Congress has taken, which is a broad prohibition on self-preferencing by large technology companies, is going to accomplish anything that will protect consumers.
Yeah, and you're talking about specific things. You're talking about data-driven points there. The actual language in the act itself is, quote, strong and flexible tools. But this is broad stroke legislation. That doesn't say strong and flexible tools to me. That doesn't say focus to me. I see a problem here where the rhetoric is not matching the black and white of the actual act. I know we've had other people on this program. We've talked about it. What they're saying in the committees and what they're saying in the pitching of this act is not matching up the black and white of how it's going to be enforced, is it?
I agree. And like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, self-preferencing is another word for generic products. And I think most of us would agree that we buy generic products and they are ultimately helpful to us and other consumers. And so Congress says that we are going to protect consumers by enabling the FTC to crack down on self-preferencing. But ultimately, they're not protecting consumers. And so the rhetoric does not match up with ultimately what will occur under the act.
Yeah, and a way to kind of loop this back to where we started. We've already established you're one of these glutton for punishments like me. You like to actually watch these congressional hearings. We know all the viral clips from like the Facebook hearings and the tech hearings with Twitter and other things where the senators don't really understand how it works and it's really apparent fast. Does Congress just not have a good handle on what the modern consumer is with the online, the multiple methods of doing things now? It sure feels almost like the tech thing where they don't understand how Twitter works and they don't understand how Facebook works. I just really wonder if Congress doesn't have a good grip on how much consumerism has changed in the last 10, 15 years in the smartphone era.
Yeah, it seems like as a whole, the federal government is grappling with its understanding of technology and how it wants to define certain terms across the American economy. And specifically, I think Republicans and Democrats are actually talking past one another and they have different goals in mind. I think Republicans see a bill like this as punishing technology companies and making it more difficult for them to do things like kick President Trump off of Twitter. That I think they would see that as a form of self-preferencing against their own views. Whereas I think Democrats are interested in economic self-preferencing, like we discussed, making sure that small vendors on Amazon Marketplace have the same visibility as Amazon basic products. And so those are two fundamentally different concerns. And so if Republicans want to accomplish X and Democrats want to accomplish Y with this bill, I think it's going to actually accomplish Z. And we'll get neither of the outcomes that they want.
And to be fair to the FTC, because I don't think it's fair for us to advocate for better government if we don't give them an avenue to be better. Is it fair to the FTC what we're asking them to do here? Because is this going to pull them away from their core competency? And is that going to let things that really are important, like some real antitrust that's out there? Because let's be honest, there's lots of companies that want to push, they're always pushing the boundaries because that's what they do. Is there a danger here that you're going to overstretch this organization and they're going to miss some of the important stuff of their core competency that they should be paying attention to?
That's definitely my main concern. The FTC is ultimately a good agency. It plays a vital role in the US economy, whether it's reviewing mergers or promulgating rules to protect consumers. If we're now distracting the agency by asking it to look at dubious prohibitions against self-preferencing, which might not even hurt consumers, then some anti-competitive mergers, which should have been looked at more carefully, are much more likely to slip through the cracks. Or some rulemaking, which is supposed to improve the US economy, will actually be not as thought through as it should have and will end up harming the US economy. Those are definitely my concerns.
Yeah, Andy Jung from Tech Freedom joining us. All right, we've been bashing on Congress pretty hard here, been talking about how they don't really understand what they're doing. Give me some good news. You follow this stuff. is there good tech news in Congress, either legislatively or just overall conversation? Is there any good news on the horizon of how our representatives are looking at technology and the expansion of, and I know we talk about regulation as a bad thing, but some things do need regulated. So give us some good news somewhere in here to end this up on.
Well, I think this is good news, but it depends who you ask. So I think we're headed towards a national privacy bill, which would put rules in place for how companies are allowed to collect and use data from consumers. And those rules would apply across the entire national economy. I think that's an improvement over where we currently are. Currently, Congress is trying to use antitrust law to fix things such as consumer privacy. And I don't think it's going to work out. I think there's going to be unintended consequences like we've discussed. But the good news is that certain parts of Congress and the federal government are getting more focused on those specific harms. One of those specific harms, I would argue, are harms to consumer privacy and data security. And it sounds like we're starting to address those with a much more clear vision these days. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, things like tech literacy in the Congress and the Senate, one of those things that's going to happen gradually, then suddenly, I believe. So we'll keep on top of it. Andy Jung, great information today, sir. Let folks know about your social media, your writing, what you're doing at Tech Freedom so they can continue to follow you.
I am on Twitter. Follow me at Andy Jung Tech. I'm a legal fellow at Tech Freedom. Follow our work at techfreedom.org. I have a piece on National Review called Overextending the FTC. That's what we discussed today. I also have a new piece on Real Clear Markets, also talking about the FTC, that came out this morning. So go check that out as well.
Fantastic. We will link all that stuff in the show notes so folks can find it. Andy Jung, I'm sure we're going to be talking about tech for the rest of our lifetimes. So hopefully sooner than that, we'll have you back on and we'll hash this out again, my friend. Thank you for your time today.
This was great fun. Thanks so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.